It's really a huge pleasure to be able to introduce Dr. Michael Danti to you this evening. Michael was a Penn PhD, and we have known each other since those many years ago. I'm not going to say how many years, Michael, right? Michael is a Near Eastern archaeologist and cultural heritage expert with over 30 years of experience directing archaeological programs and preservation initiatives in Syria, Iraq, Iran, and the United States. Since 2018, he has served as the program manager of the Iraq Heritage Stabilization Program at the University of Pennsylvania, which preserves and protects cultural heritage sites in northern Iraq and Syria damaged by terrorist activity and recent warfare. As a field archaeologist, Michael directs the Penn, Nimrud, and Nineveh projects, which include archaeological excavations, surveys, and cultural heritage management components. He has written numerous official reports and scholarly articles on the cultural heritage crises in the Middle East, and has been a regular public speaker and presenter on television and radio to raise awareness of the plight of our global cultural patrimony. He has testified before the U.S. House Foreign Affairs Subcommittee on Terrorism, Non-Proliferation and Trade, on cultural property crimes in the conflict zones of Syria and Iraq, and he was elected a Fellow of the Society of Antiquaries of London in 2011. He also has an appointment as a consulting scholar at the Penn Museum. So let's welcome Michael now for his presentation, Archaeology in Action, New Insights into Ancient Nineveh and Nimrud. Michael.
Thank you, Steve. I will now share my screen. And hopefully we will go into the slideshow. How's that? So.
Nothing yet, Michael.
Sorry about that. Try to share my screen again. There we go. How's that?
Perfect.
Thank you very much. Sorry about that, everyone. Coming to you from Groton, Massachusetts. It's great to be here. Again, I'm the director of the Iraq Heritage Stabilization Program, which was founded in 2018 at the University of Pennsylvania in Middle Eastern Languages and Civilizations. I direct the program with Dr. Richard Zettler, and I work with Dr. Darren Ashby. And we have a number of projects in Iraq and in Syria to preserve and protect cultural heritage. And just a little bit quickly about our mission, really, we safeguard cultural rights through enhancing, protecting, and expanding access to cultural heritage. And we're particularly involved in the preservation and protection of the heritage of persecuted minority communities in the region that have been targeted for cultural cleansing and genocide. So a lot of different projects. We are currently implementing or have finished now 17 projects in the region, primarily through funding from the U.S. Department of State, the Olive Foundation in Geneva, and other private sources, and the University of Pennsylvania. I'm going to be speaking today about two of our archaeological projects, Nineveh and Nimrud. These two projects have cultural heritage preservation components to them, but they're really also about a research effort to better understand these two capital cities of the Neo-Assyrian Empire. So just a little bit of background about the Neo-Assyrian Empire in northern Mesopotamia, the area of northern Iraq. This is the early Iron Age, or the period from 1000 to 612 BC. And during this time, the Assyrian Empire rose up and took in a large amount of territory across northern Iraq and western Syria. Now, I divide this into three phases for the purpose of this talk. We have the foundations of empire from 1000 to 824 BC. And this is a time when Syria is emerging out of a period of weakness. In the previous late Bronze Age, or the Middle Assyrian period, there was a territorial state that was very similar in extent to the area in dark green on the map. Then that essentially came apart at about 1200, 1100 BC. Then around 1000, the Assyrian kings began to expand back out from their core area around the city of Ashur. And during this first phase, King Ashur-Nasir-Pal in particular expanded the empire to take in this area, again, that had previously been controlled by the Assyrians in the Middle Assyrian period. And he founded a new capital city, or at least an administrative capital, at Nimrud, the ancient city of Kalhu, which is located here, also the biblical Kala, on the Tigris River. This was a really watershed event, and that will be the first part of my talk, talking about ancient Nimrud and Kala. Then there is a period of weakness again, from 824 BC to 745 BC. And during this time, Syria sort of closes back in on itself a little bit. Local governors become very powerful, and the Assyrian kings don't really have a lot of foreign policy. There are not a lot of attested military campaigns in foreign regions. Now, we'll be talking about this time period because we're excavating a palace from this period that belongs to King Adad-Nerari III. Then, with the beginning of a king named Tiglath-Pileser III, around 745, the Assyrians expand back out, and they take in this entire area in greed. Their empire essentially at this point in time rapidly takes in a large part of southeastern Anatolia or Turkey. It extends across western Iran down to the head of the Persian Gulf, and they eventually conquer Egypt. And that lasts until the very end of the 7th century. And then between 614 and 612, the Assyrian Empire collapses. They are defeated by a coalition of Medes from western Iran and Babylonians from in central Iraq. We'll be talking about that collapse at different points in the talk as well. So to start off with the site of Nimrud, on the left you see a satellite image of the city of Nimrud. It's a massive site. It takes in 360 hectares, and the outer wall that you see here running around the site spans about 7.5 kilometers. So it's a huge site. The core of it is the Acropolis or citadel here. It's a high mound that even at the time of the Neo-Assyrian Empire had already had several thousand years of human occupation in its lower levels. So a very ancient site. That citadel is 400 meters east-west by 600 meters north to south. And when Ashur-nasir-pal II made this his capital, really the site consisted of this citadel. And he essentially cleared this area and began building temples and palaces on the citadel and built a wall around that. And then he enclosed an area adjacent to the site for a lower town in which he settled people that he had captured, captives that he had taken away from various parts of his new kingdom. So that area essentially also had a lot of Assyrians too, but would be a very interesting place to excavate. But surprisingly, even after a couple hundred years of work at Nimrud, no one's really worked in this outer town area. In the southeastern part of the site, there was a palace and arsenal called Fort Shalmaneser. This was an area where the Assyrian kings stored their loot. Their soldiers and their cavalry were stationed here, and the kings kept a palace there called an Ekal Masharti, or review palace, for reviewing their military forces. So a very large archaeological site. And some of my pictures from the last couple of seasons, this is a view from Fort Shalmaneser, or the arsenal, back toward the Citadel Mound. You can see how large that is. And off in the distance, you can see the high plateau that skirts the Tigris River, and you can see the floodplain there at the base of that. In antiquity, the Tigris would have flowed right up against the site, but since the time of Ashur-nasir-pal II, the river has slowly been moving westward away from the site. And then looking back the other way, this is from the Citadel or Acropolis, looking out across the lower mound towards Fort Shalmaneser, that little mound where the red arrow is located. So it's a very large site in a very good condition for the most part. And here's the entrance to Fort Shalmaneser, or the Assyrian king's arsenal, also in very good condition. The Nimrud was first excavated very early on in the history of Near Eastern archaeology by Sir Austen Henry Layard. He was a traveler and explorer who was on his way to India and stopped in Turkey and then traveled around Iraq and Iran, was fascinated with the ancient remains of the region. And he came upon the plan of excavating at some of these Assyrian sites in northern Iraq. mainly because the French were starting to do this in the area of Mosul. So he was able to convince the British consul, Sir Stratford Canning, in Istanbul to sponsor excavations, and he chose the site of Nimrud to begin his work. And he carried out 2 campaigns from 1845 to 47, and again in 1849 to 51, working at Nimrud, which he misidentified as Nineveh at first, and then also working at the site of Nineveh in eastern Mosul. And he really put the Assyrians in the Assyrian Empire on the map. He was really a quite good archaeologist for the time. He had decent recording by contemporary standards. And what he was really known for was being able to find a lot of sculptures, cuneiform tablets, and artifacts and get them back to the British Museum, as you can see in this illustrated London News article from 1852. He shipped a lot of sculpture down the Tigris River and then by way of the Persian Gulf and the Mediterranean back to London. And this created a sensation in Victorian England. He was also a prolific writer and wrote a number of popular accounts of his excavations. Probably the most popular was Nineveh and its Remains, which is really mostly about Nimrud. He wrote travel logs and a lot of other popular works, real subject matter on the Middle East. And he later went into politics. He didn't stay in archaeology all that long, but he had trained a number of people in archaeology, and his work was carried on really up through the Crimean War. And then there have been a number of other campaigns at the site since that time, obviously. So Layard's most famous work at Nimrud were his excavations of the Northwest Palace. This was the palace built by King Ashur-nasir-pal II on the citadel, on top of a massive brick platform. This was a new foundation for the king and something that Ashur-nasir-pal was very proud of. The entrances had large lamassu colossi, winged human-headed bulls, and the walls were lined with large numbers of carved reliefs in gypsum called Assyrian reliefs that depicted the major military campaigns of the ruler, religious scenes, and other scenes of Ashur-nasir-pal's reign, with inscriptions to go along with them. Layard drew a lot of these, and he shipped large numbers of them back to England. He also excavated to the north of the Northwest Palace in the area of the stepped platform or ziggurat, a temple tower at the far north end of the site that was built by Ashur-nasir-pal and his son Shalmaneser III. And Layard excavated in the temple of the warrior god Ninurta at the base of the ziggurat and the adjacent Ishtar Temple. Ishtar is the goddess of love and war. And here I'm showing you one of the colossal lions that guarded the entrance to the Ishtar Temple on the left, and a scene showing the god Ninurta chasing the Anzu bird, a force of chaos that comes from the facade of the Ninurta Temple. So very important excavations. And as you can see from the sketch map, there was a lot of other work at Nimrud as well. But those are the primary things that we're going to be discussing today. But I just want to point out, he also excavated an area called the Upper Chambers, a very poorly understood area. Layard, it's even questionable whether he even saw his own excavations in this area, but he did excavate there, and that's one of the areas where I'm working now. Now, again, since Layard's time, there have been lots of different expeditions at Nimrud, probably most famously the British School of Archaeology in Iraq, excavated for a number of years, starting in 1949, under the directorship of Sir Max Mallowan, the husband of the mystery author Agatha Christie. So again, a lot of famous people have been to Nimrud in the past, and there were Iraqi excavations in the 1980s and 90s, really up until about 2003, and I'll be mentioning them occasionally. But with the US invasion in 2003, work at the site came to a halt. There was a lot of neglect of the site, unfortunately, during the period of sanctions in Iraq. And then with the coming of the so-called Islamic State terrorist organization in 2014, the site was occupied by extremists from the Islamic State, and they wreaked havoc on Nimrud and Nineveh and a lot of other cultural heritage sites in northern Iraq, unfortunately. They blew up the reconstruction of the Northwest Palace with barrel bombs, and as you'll see, they did a lot of damage to the ziggurat. and the various temples at the site. So when we started to go back to Iraq in 2018, we were aware that a lot needed to be done at Nimrud and at the site of Nineveh as well in Mosul. And we discussed potential projects with the Iraqi State Board of Antiquities and Heritage, our partners in our projects. So again, after those discussions, we decided with our Iraqi partners that it would be good to return to two poorly understood areas at Nimrud, the Ishtar Temple and the Nurta Temple area at the base of the ziggurat, and this upper chambers area, or the Palace of King Adad-Nerari III. He comes from that inter-regnum period that I discussed, a lesser-known ruler who had added on to the Northwest Palace here to its south. The Iraqis had reconstructed the monumental entrance to the Ishtar Temple, as you see here. And here's the ziggurat. Now, this is before ISIS in 2013. The Iraqis liked to rebuild these monuments that had been excavated in baked brick so that there's really something to look at. And here's the Ishtar Temple looking from the heights of the ziggurat down at it. And again, there's that monumental arched entrance or vaulted entrance. And these are the various areas that were excavated by Layard and by the Iraqi expedition under Muzahim Hussein. Now, that was all destroyed by the Islamic State. At the top, you see a before satellite image of the Ishtar Temple and the ziggurat. And in 2016, August, and then by October, there was clearly earth-moving equipment that had leveled the Ishtar Temple, and the ziggurat had been cut down to about a third of its height. The ziggurat was about 30 to 35 meters tall. It was probably 42 meters plus in antiquity. So this is what it looked like when we began work at the site in 2022. So this is the before shot of the monumental entrance. This is what it looked like after the Islamic State took an earth mover to it. And this is the plan of the temple. Layard excavated the Holy of Holies, or cella of the temple, where the cult statue of Ishtar, in this case in her astral aspect, Ishtar Sharrat Niphi in Akkadian, or Ishtar of the rising Venus or rising disk. So it's an astral version of the goddess of love and war. And Muzahim Hussein excavated this monumental eastern entrance in parts of this courtyard. So we'll be moving about this plan here for a little bit. This is what the monumental entrance looked like in 2022. Muzahim Hussein had found colossal lions, much like Layard had found colossal lions at the entrance of the cella in the 1840s and 50s. But the ones found by the Iraqis were not very well preserved. They had probably been damaged when the Medes and Babylonians sacked and burned this temple sometime around 614 to 612 BC. The bricks that you see here are from the Iraqi reconstruction in the 1990s. Based on the ancient remains, of course. These are the lions at the entrance that were found by the Iraqi expedition under Muzahim Hussein. And here you see, before ISIS, you see the preservation of the ziggurat. When Muzahim Hussein excavated, he also found a second entrance into the courtyard here, a large entrance, and he found small statues, half colossi, if you will, of winged bulls, or Lamassu, flanking either side of this entrance. Now, these fortunately went to the Baghdad Museum and were safe during the Islamic State occupation. They're only about 2 meters tall. Usually, these guardian figures at the doorways to palaces and temples are usually 3 to 5 meters tall, so much larger. So this was the state of the temple when the Iraqis stopped excavation and Islamic State came along. And then what Islamic State did, they didn't just take an earth mover and destroy the Eastern Gateway. They also began excavating with the earth mover this way, beyond where the Lamassu were, moving westward into undisturbed archaeological deposits. And what you're looking at here on the right is their trench that they dug with an earth mover. And you can see all this horrible modern garbage that's been thrown in here. This is a photo after the region had been liberated from ISIS. The Iraqi State Board of Antiquities and Heritage went in and they took pictures of what ISIS has done to assess the site of Nimrud. And then after a big rain, You can see the washing out from the rain here. Stone stele, a red stone stele or standing stone with relief carving came out. This was a very exciting discovery. And the Iraqis built a little brick enclosure around this to protect it from the elements. And it was there at the start of our excavations in 2022. So this area obviously was really important. So this is where we started our excavations this last spring, because we were interested in what these walls that you see here represent and what the stone stele was doing there. What was ISIS doing excavating in this area, and what sort of antiquities might they have found during their illicit excavations? By digging in this area, we might be able to determine that, and also look for things on the illicit antiquities market that ISIS might be selling that comes from Nimrud, and try to get those objects repatriated back to the Iraqi State Board of Antiquities. So this spring, we excavated this entire area. You can see where the Lamasi, we're looking westward now towards the ziggurat. You can see here where the Lamasi were located, the area of ISIS damage, where that stone floor paving was removed by the front loader that ISIS used to dig in this area. They just narrowly missed this stone stele and some other stone features over here against the wall. Now, this is a wall running along the west end of this. And here you see a gateway leading into the Ninurta Temple. So what we have here is going from the Ishtar courtyard. We come into this gate chamber where you see the stele, and there was this pedestal next to it in stone. You turned a corner, and then there was another gate here, and you went into the courtyard of the Ninurta Temple. Now, this in and of itself was very exciting to us because we had finally found the much looked for linkage between these two temples. We also found a chamber that's extending to the south, but we really didn't have, you see it here on the right, we didn't have a lot of time to excavate and continue that way. So we have walls here, a doorway leading in this way. And so at this fall, when we go back out at the end of this month, we will continue excavation in the Ninurta courtyard. And Dr. Ashby will continue excavating this way south towards the Northwest Palace to see what's inside this other chamber. So what we have is essentially a gate here. These horseshoe-shaped stone features in the floor are the covers of what we call pivot boxes. There are holes in the floor that were set up, you see one here on the right, to take the posts of the large cedar gates, pairs of gates. Now this one was removed by ISIS. There's another set here. They didn't have hinges for these large gates in antiquity. The gate posts set down into these holes in the floor, and they pivoted on pivot stones. You see one here at the bottom of this hole. And then these fancy stone covers were put over the top of these pits in the floor to protect the base of these posts that held the door leaves. So there was a gate here and a gate here. You can see that here in this nice reconstruction that shows what's below the floor level, the base of the gate posts on their pivot stones, and then the gate posts rising up to their finials. And then you have the door leaves made of cedar from Lebanon. And then there are bronze bands nailed to the gate boards that usually have embossed decoration on them. And you can see how they would bolt the doors shut. And they actually bolted our door also with a bolt hole in the floor so that they could lock it that way too. We have a lot of information already just from the floor and the surrounding remains on these gates. And there's our stele and a socle made out of a different type of stone next to it. A socle or a pedestal that probably held a statue. I'll show you what was found in that area in a moment. So this stele is really intriguing. As we excavated, we realized that it had been smashed up in antiquity, and pieces of it were all over the floor in this area here at the base of it. And one piece had a depiction of the goddess Ishtar Sharrat Niphi, or Ishtar, Queen of the Rising Venus. Now, this would have been situated up in the upper field of the stele, along with other depictions of various gods that were important to the Assyrian kings. We'll talk about who's shown here in the main part of the stele next, but this is just a smaller part of the stele that was up at the top, and she would have been there with, again, other gods like Nabu, maybe Ninurta, and some others. And it's an incredible depiction of the goddess. Probably the most detailed that we have. The other depictions that we have of Ishtar, Sharrat, Niphi come from small cylinder seal stains that are done very abstract terms. And you see the goddess holding a ring of kingship extending it out in her left hand. Her right hand is extended in greeting. She wears a pointed crown. Her hair is done up in braids and in a sort of I guess it's like a bun. And then she's inside of a disc. And off of that, there are 13 rays. And at the end, each terminates in a rosette that is a star with its own rays. And her head forms the 14th of those rays, essentially. And you can see here that, I mean, someone went to great trouble to smash her off of the stele. And it looks like they took a pointed object like a pick, a digging pick, and slammed it into her here. So this is iconoclasm probably at the end of the 7th century by the Medes and the Babylonians, if I had to guess. Now, again, most of our depictions of the goddess are from cylinder seals, but you can see it's a very similar sort of iconography, the way that she's depicted, again, with reaching out with a ring, her hand up in greeting, wearing a crown. She's usually one leg forward in a stride with that leg coming out a slitted skirt. Here's the goddess here again on a pedestal with astral symbols around her, and again with the rays terminating in discs, crown, one bare leg out. In this case, she's holding a mace. But these are cylinder seals from other sites. Now, who is it then that's depicted on the main part of the stele? It doesn't look to be Ishtar. First of all, these individuals are not wearing a slitted skirt with a bare leg sticking out. This is probably the deity because this individual is standing on a platform and that individual is holding a mace. And unfortunately, the upper part's missing. We're hoping from all the fragments that we can reconstruct this. And the other individual, both are barefoot. The other individual, can't make up much, but their garment is very similar to other depictions of, Assyrians from other sites. Here you have a garment with a diagonal seam with tassels at the bottom of it. It looks just like this. This is from a different time period and a different site, but you can see that it's sort of typical of Assyrian garments of the time period of the 9th through 7th centuries. So can't really tell who this deity is. Could it be Ninurta? No definitive evidence of that either, but if I had to guess, maybe this gateway was considered more part of the neighboring Ninurta temple than it was the Ishtar temple. And I would expect if this was Ishtar, Sharrat, Niphi, that you would see someone striding with a bare leg in the front like that. So hopefully, again, with conservation and reconstruction, we'll be able to say a lot more about the stele. We're going to be moving the stele to the lab this fall, and we're hoping that there'll be inscriptions on the back or base of it. And if I had to guess, I'd say those inscriptions will be of Ashur-nasir-pal II. Next to this was a socle. It had tar inside of it that had been used to secure a statue. That statue was smashed up. It was made of limestone. We did not find much of the statue, but we found small pieces with cuneiform inscriptions on them. We were able to make out some words. John McGinnis is working on the bits of the inscription that we have. And it's fairly clear that this is a statue inscription, and it is probably from a statue of the same size and dimensions as the famous Kurba'il statue of Ashur-nasir-pal's son, Shalmaneser III, from the arsenal at Nimrud. So it would have been a statue of the king with an inscription on it, probably detailing some of his military campaigns, but it looks to have been smashed and stolen from the temple when the building was burned around 612 BC. And you can see the damage that had occurred because of the fire to the socle, and the red color of the neighboring stele is also because of the fire. And there's lots of evidence of the fire throughout the temple. This is opposite the stele in the south fill. In the chamber that's continuing to the south, you're looking at a section here of the area that we'll be excavating in the fall. And what you're looking at in this layer with the red arrows are the leaves of a burned cedar gate. And we know from Ashur-nasir-pal's inscriptions from the colossal lions from the Ishtar Temple, we have inscriptions from this temple about this temple, from these colossal lions, that he used cedar doors in this structure, large cedar gate leaves, and he decorated them with bronze knobbed nails. Okay, and he also had cedar beams in the roof. So that's what was on fire. in 612 BC. But what about these bronze knobbed nails? Well, there's the lions. That's one of the more intact lions that Layard brought back that's in the British Museum. So we found lots of bronze nails in the burned layer that you saw previously. And we even found one of the finials from a gate post. In this case, it's from ivory and it's carved out of probably elephant tusk. And then in the charcoal layer with the nails, we began finding burned, and in some cases almost completely melted, bronze bands with embossed decoration. And this is a close-up of one of them. They have palmettes and rosettes, and you see the holes for the nails. And these were nailed to the cedar doors. They decorated them in strips. And you can see in this case, there is a file of captives that have been captured by the Assyrian army. And they have bags over their shoulders that hold their possessions. And they're probably being marched off to be settled in the lower city of Nimrud. This is one of the conquests of King Ashur-nasir-pal II, almost certainly. And this is a scene probably of tribute. There's a pile of these bands that are folded on top of each other, on top of one of the socket boxes for the gate. And you see a groom, an Assyrian groom, leading a horse here. And there's a row of these horses that are probably being brought to the Assyrian king as booty, possibly, if I had to guess, from Western Iran. So pretty spectacular stuff. There are only a few places where similar decorated bronze gates have been found. And in the 19th century, at a site not far from Nimrud, a site called Balawat, excavators there found sets of these bronze gates at a palace of Ashur-nasir-pal II and a temple there. This is just really not all that far away from Nimrud, but again, these are fairly rare. This is a reconstruction of one of those gates that was at the British Museum, and I believe later went to the Baghdad Museum. So a very exciting find. Now, throughout the burned debris, we're finding a lot of artifacts that I don't really have time to talk about from the sacking of the temple, but we have Ashur-nasir-pal inscriptions on the limestone floor pavings. So we know this is a construction, again, of Ashur-nasir-pal. And it's a standard inscription that details his founding of the city of Nimrud and his military conquests. And they are in the gateway on the door sill as well. On the right, you see an enlargement of that. So a lot for our epigraphers to do at the site and our artists. And incidentally, these marks in the floor here are from the teeth of the bucket of the front loader that was used by ISIS or their followers to loot in the site. So we have no idea how much disturbance they might have, caused to parts of the gate bands or some of the other artifacts in here, unfortunately. But a surprising amount is intact on the floors, and we can see where ISIS actually penetrated down to the floor level. They were bouncing the bucket off the stone floor. So here's our Ishtar Temple as we understand it from Layard's excavations and the Iraqi excavations. There's the gate chamber that we've just excavated. And there's the Ninurta Temple, which is excavated by Austen Henry Layard and by Max Mallowan. This is a fairly poorly known temple. We are planning to continue our excavations this fall between the two buildings towards the ziggurat in this area of the Ninurta courtyard and this chamber going to the south. And we're hoping that we'll find monumental entrances with colossi if we're lucky, or who knows what else might be in these areas. But Layard made some pretty amazing discoveries when he dug in the 1850s along the facade of this Ninurta temple. He found lamassu here that stand about 4 meters high. They are human-headed lions and a lot of relief sculptures just opposite the same courtyard of where we're excavating now. Now, moving to another area and moving away from the founding of the city, I mentioned that interregnum period, the second phase of the Assyrian Empire, where the Assyrian kings were weak. So we were looking at the Ishtar Temple. There's the northwest palace of Ashur-nasir-pal. And then there's this area called the Upper Chambers that Layard excavated in 1850-51. Now, we decided to go back into this area because the recording that Layard gave us on this area is really poor. There have been questions for over 170 years about what was actually discovered in this area of the upper chambers. But scholars had decided that these upper chambers shown here on the right probably formed part of what's called a palatial residential reception suite, part of a palace where there would be a throne room and a retiring room, a bathroom, and a treasury for the queen or the king, or some of the royal consorts of the king. Now, these reception suites also had what was called a lustration slab, an area for ritual cleansing made out of marble or gypsum on the floor, and there would be these tram rails. They're a lot like little railroad lines made out of stone, so that people could roll little bronze wagons that had braziers on top of them for a fire, and they could roll them closer or further from essentially the lustration slab. And we think that these braziers with their fires were used to heat water, and the water was used then in some sort of cleansing rituals or ablutions at the lustration slabs, but it's poorly understood. Now, Layard found a lot of interesting things in the upper chambers. He didn't spend much time here, clearly, but the doorways into these chambers had these inscribed door sills, and they provided the very long genealogy of King Adad-Nerari III, going from his father all the way back to essentially an eponymous ancestor, but an accurate genealogy that was very important for, in the early days of Assyriology and Henry Creswick Rawlinson's decipherment of cuneiform writing systems for the genealogy of the Assyrian kings. And this one was sawn into pieces and taken back to the British Museum. When we re-excavated this area, we found these stone chips on the floor from Layard sawing these up in 1851. So we're also doing the archaeology of Victorian archaeologists. This area had been largely filled back in with earth since Layard's time. Now we have excavated, here you see, Layard's upper chambers. We have now, as of this spring, excavated quite a bit more of this palatial residential reception suite. In room 2, what we have is the equivalent of what's called a retiring room, a long room that would be behind the reception room. So this is the big public space where you met with people, or it could be a throne room for a king. And then there was a retiring room behind that. We found a column base here that is completely unattested in Assyrian architecture. It's a very interesting tapered column base with a rounded base. The stem of it has these protuberances on it. And then here you see it comes to a very flat top, probably so that it had a wooden shaft. And there is an iron rod inside of it for affixing that shaft. Lots of fallen brick from the destruction level of the palace. So that was a bit of a surprise. Here's the top view of that column. Here's the side view of it. And nearby, we also found a capital. So a very interesting architectural discovery, looking for parallels in early Greek, Anatolian, and Egyptian architecture for these, so far unsuccessfully. We found an alabastron not far from that on the floor that holds exactly 20 liters, and it appears to have fallen from the upper level or second story of the palace. There's a lot of material that fell from the upper stories of the palace when it was destroyed. We're finding a lot of socket box covers with cuneiform inscriptions and smashed up door sills. This palace, after the time of Adad-Nerari III, was left derelict for a while, and a lot of bad things happened to it during the late Assyrian period, and then presumably it was also burned in 612 BC. So there was a lot of robbing of bricks out of it and stone, probably by later kings like Esarhaddon. On the floors, we're finding some pretty spectacular stuff that shows a lot of elite activities, banqueting, foreign trade. There's inscribed ostrich eggshell, hundreds of pieces of ostrich eggshell, but only one piece that's inscribed from the floor. We have glazed ceramics from the floor, in this case showing an ostrich. In the middle example, a cuneiform inscription. We have ivories from various rooms with flowers, rosettes, guilloche patterns, and a lot of other carving from smaller objects, pieces of furniture and boxes, perhaps writing boards that had ivory inlay on them. In room 2 and in other rooms, we have fallen plaster with multiple layers of wall paintings in really vibrant colors. Now we know from Layard's excavations that he also had in the upper chambers area wall paintings as well, and his were preserved several meters high on the walls. Now, when Layard left these excavations, these walls just deteriorated and collapsed. So obviously, those aren't preserved very well, but he at least did fairly good color drawings of the ones that he had in the northern area of this palace that show kneeling bulls, again, these rosettes and medallions and various other motifs. During our excavations, we also re-excavated Layard's rooms, and from this vestibule, we worked into room 4, which was probably a treasury in this reception suite, and we found another one of these inscribed door sills with beautiful cuneiform inscriptions that provide the genealogy of King Adad-Nerari III. This was a relief because we were worried that ISIS had taken it or had smashed it up. Layard didn't take this one, obviously, and it had been reburied. Its cousin, which is over at the other side of the vestibule, is now on a wall at the British Museum. And here's one of our epigraphers, John McGuinness, for scale. John is almost like, I don't know, 6'5", so it's a poor scale for this. But to show you just how large this slab actually is, and on the right, we're looking at it, and Dr. Ali Jabouri, Mosul University, is getting to check his translation of the inscription that he had done back in the 1990s. He was very pleased to see it uncovered again. Now, this treasury, or room 4, has a baked brick floor. We noticed that it had a depression in it. When we excavated, we also noticed that the bricks had stamps of Adad-Nerari. These bricks say Palace of Adad-Nerari on them, which is very nice. This had never been reported previously. So Adad-Nerari considered this a palace. But again, there's this depression in the floor. And when we opened that up, what did we find? Another column base buried beneath the floor. Never used, apparently never finished. So a lot of things below this palace that we hope to be looking at this fall. We excavated the neighboring room that is with the lustration slab and the tram lines. They're still there after Layard's 1850-51 excavations, but they're in a completely different location than where Layard records them on the plan, and they're different dimensions than what Layard shows. This gives you an idea of what Layard found. All this earth in the section that you see behind the lustration slab and the tram line, this had all filled in after Layard's 1850 excavation to give you an idea of how much debris that we're removing from the old Victorian period excavations to the site. And we found 2 new door sills in the courtyard to this building outside room 6. So we have new door sills as well that hadn't been found by Layard. And so what did we have here? Well, we have part of a palace. It has all the elements of the palace, but who lived here? We know from inscriptions that Adad-Nerari probably used, if didn't live in with his wives, in the Northwest Palace to the north of this building. So my question is, was this a building that Adad-Nerari maybe built for his very powerful mother, Queen Semiramis or Shamu-Ramat? Adad-Nerari came to the throne as a boy, and his mother ruled for a period of time, essentially, as an independent regent. She is recorded in inscriptions, which is pretty much unheard of in ancient Assyria. The governors of the Assyrian provinces refer to her with her son in their dedicatory inscriptions, and she led a military campaign. So she was a very important female ruler in antiquity, so much so that her legend lived on into classical antiquity as the semi-legendary Queen Semiramis, who made, all the way up into the medieval period and modern era as Semiramis. So maybe this was a residential reception suite that was added to the Northwest Palace by Adad-Nerari for his aging mother after he came into his majority. It has the courtyard that we would expect, a reception room, which would also be a throne room if it were the king's, a retiring room behind it, and the vestibule, bathroom, and treasury. The one thing it's lacking so far are the 2 things that are lacking are a throne base. Maybe that's in the unexcavated part of room 6, but I doubt it. And any sculpted relief slabs on the walls. The walls seem to have been decorated with elaborate plaster painting. So there's a later depiction, 17th century depiction of Queen Semiramis, very famous in antiquity as a powerful warrior queen. But with the coming of Christianity, she was vilified. She became synonymous with promiscuous behavior. There are legends that she was involved in all sorts of other sinful stuff. We're hoping that we can actually find that this was a building that was used by Semiramis and maybe learn more about this powerful female ruler. We know painfully little about her despite the legend. Now, moving on to our other excavations quickly at the site of Nineveh. Looking at the site of Nineveh here from our house on the site of Nineveh, we're looking out across the lower mound. It's a lot like Nimrud in its general layout. There's a citadel mound. You're looking at it here in the background called Kuyunjik. King Sennacherib moved the capital to this site at the end of the 8th century to found a new capital because his father had died in warfare, and this was considered very inauspicious and bad luck, right? So they founded this new capital in the area of modern Mosul, north of Kala or Nimrud. It has this citadel, it has an arsenal and a vast lower mound. And Sennacherib built a huge fortificational wall around it with 18 gates. And again, he settled this with the Syrians and also with forced resettlement of captives from various regions surrounding Assyria. Now, we are excavating the Mashki Gate of Nineveh. The site covers, again, 7.5 kilometers, so it's much larger than Nimrud, and its walls stretch for 12 kilometers. So it's a massive site. And it suffered really heavily from Victorian period excavation. Layard excavated extensively in Kuyunjik, looking for Assyrian remains to send back to the British Museum. He did a lot of tunneling, and the main building that he excavated there is the Southwest Palace of King Sennacherib, a palace that Sennacherib titled his palace without rival, the largest palace we have from ancient Assyria. It is huge. Layard found kilometers worth of Assyrian reliefs that he drew or shipped back to the British Museum, but a lot of them were left there, and eventually the trenches filled back in. Unfortunately, he didn't record all of them, but it was a really elaborately decorated palace. So an incredible achievement for Sennacherib. He was very proud of the palace, so much so that some of the reliefs depict his building of the palace. And he has depictions on the walls of the quarrying of the stone for this palace and the carving of a colossal winged bull, human-headed bull, or lamassu, that was being dragged to the Tigris, floated down the river, and brought to the palace. I don't have time to show you all of that, but Sennacherib shows himself as a warrior king. He shows scenes from his first 5 military campaigns and scenes of himself as a builder of the city. So Layard did a lot of excavation there. He didn't excavate Mashki Gate. This was excavated in the 1960s and 70s by the Iraqi Antiquities Service as a campaign to preserve the walls of Nineveh and explore the gates, which were small mounds themselves along the mound of the city wall. So the Iraqis, especially an archaeologist, Tariq Madloum, went around excavating a number of these gates. Some of them remain unexcavated. These gates were built around 695 by Sennacherib, and then they were all burned around 612 BC. In some of the gates, there are dead Assyrian soldiers and civilians that perished when the Medes and Babylonians sacked the city. Mashki Gate means the gate of the watering places because the Tigris River used to flow along this side of the city. So presumably you walked out of Mashki Gate into an area where people could get water, wash their laundry, perform ritual cleansing, what have you, their daily ablutions. The gate, again, dug in the 60s and 70s by the Iraqi Antiquities Service. This is the reconstruction that they came up with. You can find fault with that reconstruction, but it's based on the archaeological remains. I'm not going to go into how this could be improved, but they never really completed the excavations of the site. They never dug all the way down through the archaeological deposits. They dug to the 612 BC destruction level, but they didn't dig down to the floor levels of earlier kings and down to the floor level, really, of Sennacherib, the earliest floors of the building. They also didn't excavate some of the side chambers of this gate. So it's not a complete reconstruction. But, this effort helped to preserve this site Nineveh is threatened by urban expansion, and the Antiquities Service has been locked in a constant struggle to prevent people from building on Nineveh. And it's very difficult. When Islamic State came in, they, of course, bulldozed the Mashki Gate reconstruction, as you see here at the top, and they turned it back into a ruin mound. So we partnered with the Iraqi State Board of Antiquities and Heritage to excavate this site in an effort to rebuild the reconstruction of the Mashki Gate to help preserve the Nineveh archaeological part, which is on the tentative UNESCO World Heritage Site list. We cleared the site in 2021. Here you're looking to the west. This is what's left of the Iraqi reconstruction that's capping ancient archaeological remains of Sennacherib. These are the city walls to the left and right. These would have been the massive towers on either side of the gate that you see here and here. And then there's a central chamber to the gate. And we've cleared that out as well. We put a protective roof over it. And off in the distance, you see the spires of a minaret in eastern Mosul. This is right in the heart of an urban area, hence the security fence. We excavated inside in the main chamber of the gate here, or hall. You can see you would come in from the Tigris River, past that stone wall here, up a ramp, past two flanking towers, into an arched entryway into this hall or trap yard where Assyrian soldiers could attack you if you were an invader. Under another arch, presumably there were wooden gates here and here, into the lower city of Nineveh. Now you could also turn right, pass through wooden doors here into this narrow corridor, which had never been excavated. We've been excavating the hall down to the Sennacherib floor levels. We're finding a lot of artifacts and interesting things inside of here. Some of the slabs knocked down by Islamic State show that on the back of these orthostats that line the walls, made out of Mosul marble, there are inscriptions of King Sennacherib saying, "I built this." Now, the Iraqis in 1968, 69, 70 didn't excavate this side chamber over here that had an arched entrance in it. So as a part of our excavation to rebuild the Mashki Gate, we removed the blocking. This is a modern brick blocking. We removed this blocking and began excavating this corridor. And we began digging down through the debris of the 612 BC destruction of Nineveh to earlier floor levels down to the Sennacherib floor level. And lo and behold, we found that this long corridor had these Mosul marble orthostats, and we thought, well, they'll probably be plain, undecorated slabs like the hall of the gate. There's a lot of debris that fell from the upper stories of this building during the pillaging of Nineveh, the burning of the site. There's lots of burned debris and collapsed baked brick. And we cleared this down to the destruction level or latest 612 BC floor. And essentially you have this long, narrow corridor and it forms a T at the end. You could turn right, and there's a dead end. You can turn left and you can continue to the south. And we haven't excavated that way yet. We hope to do that in the coming year. And we noticed that these slabs had what looked like erased relief carving turned sideways. Now what you're looking at is a palm tree turned sideways. And these are the scales that Assyrian artists use in antiquity to show mountain terrain. Okay, that's nice. We thought these look a lot like Assyrian reliefs of Sennacherib, like the ones that Layard found in the southwest palace at Nineveh, not all that far away at the Citadel Mound of Kiyunjib. And as you began to look at them, I thought, well, you see conical shapes here. Those look like the heads of Assyrian soldiers wearing conical helmets. And I thought, well, really? You kind of squint, you shake your head. It's a little like a Rorschach test, but you think you see stuff in this, but you can make up a lot of stuff that's not there either. And then Darren Ashby, Dr. Darren Ashby, and my brother were excavating in the T of this corridor, and they were able to get behind one of the slabs because the slab extended beyond the brick wall, and they saw people's feet going down into the ground. The slabs are in a trench, set in a trench, and we thought, well, that's interesting. There are things on the back of these slabs. Let's excavate below the 612 BC destruction level floor in the main corridor and see what we find. And within about 5 minutes, we had the heads of these two archers. These slabs had been set in trenches, reused from the Southwest Palace, And then the workmen chiseled off the relief carving, but in the trench where they had to bend over to work, they just left it pristine. You can see where they took little swings at it. It looks like it happened yesterday. We had to convince people we didn't do this. And then there were stories that Islamic State had done all this. These just never been excavated previously. What you see is a pair of Assyrian archers in a mountain landscape and a kneeling archer in front of them, and how you can see people. These are Assyrian soldiers, archers and slingers, and a file of soldiers above this file, moving through the mountain terrain, fighting a foe. And once you see what's in this really well-preserved part that was below the floor, you can kind of make out what's going on in the erased sections as well. And on the right, this is it turned right side up, kneeling archer and this pair of archers. And these are as fresh as the day they were made. They're unbelievable. And then we started uncovering the rest of them. And just across the way from the archers, you have a depiction of an Assyrian military camp. This is the area that was erased. This is the area below the floor. And you can see it's a circular military camp with a wall around it and towers. Here's the entrance to the camp. And I'll show you some close-ups in a second. But in the trench, there's no slab next to this one. They just left this space blank. But in the trench that they set the slabs in, you have all these chips of marble, and they have the relief carving that the masons are tearing off the upper parts. And they just knocked the chips down into the trench and buried it. So we have a lot that we can reconstruct. Pieces of Assyrian textile, depictions of textiles, kilts, parts of a fortress, mountain scales, you name it. And here's one of the iron chisels that they were using to take off the relief carving that was in this debris pile. Nice stuff. So we began removing that floor. We've got mountain landscapes with grapes, grapevines, various types of fruit-bearing trees, and Assyrian soldiers. Again, archers with conical helmets. I guess I wasn't imagining things when we were looking at these in the previous season. Those are identical archers up here. They're just all turned sideways, 90-degree rotations. Here they are right side up in their conical helmets with incredible detail. You can see the etching in their helmets, the designs, and the ear flaps and their beards. There's our military camp with the entrance turned right side up on the right. We've got a road coming in and a tent here, a recumbent bull, a ram, various buildings for the Assyrian soldiers. But you'll notice these towers are finished with their merlins on the top, and you have the niches or windows, and this part of it isn't finished. You have a tassel here that's probably the tail of a horse, and you have a scabbard, two scabbards, and the back of an Assyrian soldier. These are his pants, there's his boot, and there's the heel of his issue. And then he's on a ground line, and there's another scene below him that shows enemy captives with their hands bound in front of them. 1, 2, 3, they're erased. You can see the outline of the camp here, this big oval. Here's some close-ups. The tent, the recumbent animals. These foreigners with their beards, wearing diadems or headbands with their hands tied in front of them, one captive facing left, the other facing right. So what's going on with these scenes? Oh, there's two horses here feeding from a manger. There's a lot going on because we can compare these to the reliefs that Layard drew from the Southwest Palace and the ones that were brought back to the British Museum. There's our captive facing left and right. And when the Assyrians use this convention, it's captives being led off into captivity. One's facing this way, the other's looking back because an Assyrian soldier's smacking him with a mace. There they are again. So a lot can be reconstructed here as to what's going on in Sennacherib's reliefs. These are from the Southwest Palace. Which campaign did they depict? Well, as we began to look, there were a lot of clues, but these things were just recycled. They were sawn into smaller pieces, set in a trench, erased. They left gaps in the lining of the corridor. You can see there's a lot of different slabs. They were broken when the gateway was burned in the destruction of 612. There are depictions of Syrian soldiers with crested helmets and ear flaps, wooden buckler shields and spears, file after file of them, one above the other. There's a close-up of the Assyrian soldiers. You can see where the ancient chisels were sort of lazily trying to take away the design. They got tired of it and they didn't erase it. Some of the slabs, only one slab was turned with its back out and its relief carving against the wall, curiously. And in this case, there was an inscription panel that it was originally the back of the slab in the Southwest Palace, and they very carefully erased the inscription that almost certainly was an inscription of Sennacherib. And that slab was the one that Darren and my brother Kevin found, had the feet going down into the ground, in which you see are two Assyrian archers leading a file of captives and something else over here off into captivity. The captives are women. You can tell from their possessions and the garments that they're wearing, and they have what we call handbags. These, they're carrying some objects here. The Assyrians have their bows and their weapons. We can tell they're Assyrians based on their musculature and the way that they're, they've got quivers and bows. You can see the hairstyles of the women here. They've got bags over their shoulders with their possessions. So these are deportees. And we can tell again what these elements are because we can look at Sennacherib's reliefs, and there are these complete versions of said saying Assyrian soldiers leading captives with similar objects being led off into captivity. In this case, what I think you have here are oxen or an ox with cart. You can see his neck, head, and sort of his back here for a cart, or it's being led by someone who's standing here. You can see feet, feet, feet. There's probably room enough for one more person, a blank space here, and then the leg of an oxen and its head here and its horns, or its ear and its horns there. So again, just some more of what we have. A fortified Assyrian encampment in the mountains with the trees carefully done. And in this case, we have an inscription of Sennacherib that was almost erased. This is an epigraph of Sennacherib that reads, "Camp of Sennacherib, king of the world, great king, mighty king, king of Assyria." Almost erased, turned sideways. And I was staring at this one day when we were cleaning it and realized it was there. Thank you for not having been erased. And on that same slab at the very top, in this area above the trees where there's a blank field, it's supposed to be sky. Somebody in antiquity carved an Assyrian king with a mace, little tiny graffiti, and other human heads and maces. Some of them have been scratched out. So a little bit of scenes of everyday, little bits of everyday life where, I don't know, bored soldiers are carving scenes, or artists may be making sketches. And on the right, you see a wine jug with a pointed base with a strap handle. I'm sure there's more of these on there. They seem to be different layers of these carved onto some of the relief slabs. And again, more trees on the neighboring slab. And the black streaks that you see on these slabs are from tar that was used in the upper stories of the building for the roof and in the bricks as a waterproofing. And I think that when they were waterproofing the building, they sometimes just sort of sloppily with their paintbrushes threw tar in the upper parts of the building, and it just splashed down on these relief slabs, and it collected then right at the floor level. Sometimes there's a line running along the floor as well. So in the trenches at the very bottom, you don't see any tar at all, where the reliefs are well preserved. So just a few quick slides on comparisons. So which campaign is this and where are these from? These are from the British Museum, and you see a military camp that is very similar like ours. And these are from the third campaign of Sennacherib. And compare on the right, Mashki Gate, to the third campaign of Sennacherib. This is Sennacherib's campaign of 701 BC against the Phoenicians of Lebanon and the coast of Syria, a campaign also against Philistia and the kingdom of Judah. Sennacherib laid siege to the city of Lachish and sacked that city, something he considered one of his great achievements. But as we know from the Book of Kings, Old Testament, and from Sennacherib's inscriptions, he also laid siege to Jerusalem, and that failed. And he went home empty-handed in that case. But he brought back a lot of wealth from Lachish. Well, look at our military scene, our camp here, and our Assyrian soldier, and look at that Assyrian soldier there. If these are not from the Lachish room, there's a Lachish room in the Southwest Palace, and they're just recycled from there. I would say these are definitely at least from Sennacherib's third campaign in the Levant from some other kingdom. So again, from about 701 BC. Assyrian archers from the third campaign, the attack or the assault on Lachish. and look at our archers. It's really amazing, the comparisons. I was pinching myself. So, in summary, we appear to have relief slabs at Mashki Gate taken from the southwest palace of Sennacherib. They depict scenes from his third campaign. And then we think in a later time period, not long before the destruction of Nineveh in 612, another king, possibly Ashurbanipal, very famous king in his own right, or Ashurbanipal's son, the last real king of the Assyrian, Sennacherib, removed these slabs when they were renovating the southwest palace. And we know that they were removing slabs, adding new reliefs to the palace, and erasing and recarving others. So this is not uncommon. These slabs were transported to the gate, sawn down into smaller pieces, and then partially erased and recycled there. Only one slab was curiously turned with its relief carving against the brick walls. The rest were, left with their designs turned 90 degrees and then meticulously erased down to the floor level. So now that we've excavated this area, we hope to continue on with the unexcavated parts of this corridor in the coming years, and we will continue now our reconstruction of Mashki Gate with the Iraqi State Board of Antiquities and Heritage, and that project is funded by very generous grants from the Olive Foundation in Geneva and from the University of Pennsylvania Museum. I want to thank everybody involved in our project, especially our excavation team, and particularly the leadership involved for the project at the Iraqi State Board of Antiquities, the Penn Museum, and at the Olive Foundation. Thank you very much.